Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of MAP Forum. My name is Nagar Okar, and I have the pleasure of hosting the weekly webinars for the Medici Archive project. Today, we're thrilled to have one of the visiting fellows at the Medici Archive project, Florence FORTE, who is finishing a PhD at Wartburg Institute in London. She's visiting Medici Archive project in Florence in 2024 and 25. So she will be talking about her fellowship and research at MAP. She also just masterminded a successful workshop that took place on September 20th in Florence. At MAP, so about 10 days ago, and the title was The Epistolary Renaissance, Women Latinists and the Republic of Letters 1300 to 1700, which is the topic of her today's talk. She's going to give an overview of this workshop and also the discussion points that they covered during this workshop. Florence, we're so happy to have you here. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation, although I know that you are not feeling well and it's very late the evening in London, but thank you so much for joining us today. Florence?
Hello, thank you very much. Let me just get my slide.
Sure.
Okay, thanks so much for the intro and obviously for everyone being here today, and also for Matt for hosting this recent workshop that I'll be talking about. It's good to be here on MAP Forum for the first time, and I think this is probably not a typical MAP Forum talk in that I'm not sharing research from a recent book or anything, but as Nagar said, I'm summarising an academic workshop hosted the other Friday on this topic of the Epistolary Renaissance. And I also thought it would be worthwhile to share a broader introduction to this topic in general, so that whether you know a lot or a little about this field, you could at least leave the talk with some new names and new sources and an insight into some approaches to those sources to take away. And there is, a huge and growing body of research on this topic. So I'm just going to scratch the surface and provide hopefully some case studies. My plan of action then is firstly to introduce the topic of women Latinists and the scope of the workshop and how this links to my broader research for my PhD and for other outlets. And then also to highlight where the idea for the workshop came about. Secondly, to highlight some case studies, as I said, and I will focus a bit more on Isotta Nogrola's Defence of Eve of 1451, which is really the reason that brought me to MAP on a longer term basis for the first year of my PhD. So I'll explore, my approach to that text and what I was doing that year, and also how it links to the Republic of Letters. And then lastly, I'll provide a quick overview of the workshop, the talks that we had, the discussion points that were raised, and essentially what we got up to over the day, because, a lot happened in one day. So firstly, the inspiration for this academic workshop originated in a course that I organised in Florence for the last 2 years with a small group of dedicated teachers and students that came from around the world, came together in Florence with the goal of reading Latin texts by women from antiquity up to the early modern period. So it was a very broad scope, and it was designed particularly for taught and research students in mind who might have had limited experience reading those texts. And the first year it was held in a salon-style environment, in a salon-style building. And in the second year it was held in the ex-convent of Le Murate, which was quite nice because that was somewhere obviously where nuns were once also producing and Latin of their own. And the idea was to not only read and discuss Latin texts, but also to visit sites and connect people and texts to places around Florence, and also to have practical activities, which meant that we could engage with the practices of production. So one highlight was becoming a scribe and for the day and copying manuscripts, which is something that the nuns would have been doing in the same context, which is something that has been highlighted in scholarship by Kate Lowe. And secondly, we looked at putting Latin into print using a printing press. And last year, we also held a research symposium at MAP itself, which for me was particularly nice because it means as a teacher, you can start to learn from your students and hear about different perspectives, and also to look forward as well as looking back, you know, about what needs to be done. And I think that's what was nice about the workshop that we organised the other week. So this course was organised around spaces of literary production. So each teacher designed their lessons based on a space, whether physical or intellectual. And that's not to say that a physical space can't be intellectual, but I'm just going to talk about some of the spaces I looked at. So in one session, we looked at the art studio as a space of literary production. So this started in antiquity, looking at Latin texts and extracts, which revealed things about female artists in ancient Greece and Rome. And a major text for that topic is obviously Pliny's Natural History. And then kind of fast forwarding and linking this to Renaissance female artists and looking particularly at their Latin signatures, reading them, comparing them, and also asking questions about why someone might write their signature in Latin rather than the vernacular, whether these were by the artist or added later, and if they're by the artist, what the elements of self-fashioning going on and how this was often linked to Pliny as well, a Plinian signature, we could say. Another space that I looked at was the forum, and because this is MAP forum, I'll just linger longer on this space. So the main question here, or the genre here, was orations, and the question was sort of when, where, and why have various women delivered Latin orations in public? And often it's for similar reasons to what their male peers were doing, such as celebrating a famous individual or a field of study, or marking the arrival or departure of a famous person, lamenting someone's passing, or pleading a case for on behalf of someone else. And I think it's an interesting topic in general, because certainly when I was starting out in this field, I would often encounter the idea in scholarship that women in the Renaissance were denied access to a rhetorical education. So the quote on the screen, "Rhetoric in all its forms lies absolutely outside the province of women." That's a quote from a 19th century historian who's essentially paraphrasing an idea that he perceived in Leonardo Bruni's humanist educational treatise. And in a really interesting article by Virginia Cox, she revisits that passage and shows that actually it seems that that quote has been taken out of context, and often it becomes cited through a chain of scholarly articles in a way in which it's not always clear if that's what Bruni said or thought, or if that's what the 19th century historian thought. So I think that raises a really interesting question about, theory and the risks of perhaps believing a prohibition at the expense of sources that actually survive by women, which is what we looked at in the lessons on the forum. So looking at actual oratorical practice, one way of looking at it, well, in my research anyway, is to look at rhetorical role models that each orator is using. And I'm just going to highlight here the classical ones, but there are many more also Christian and contemporary role models. So a classical role model for female humanists was Hortensia, as an ancient figure who was the daughter of a famous orator, Hortensius, of Cicero's time. And she gets mentioned in various sources that were available, especially to people in the early 15th century. And she's most famous for pleading a case in the forum against a sumptuary law. And whether or not Nicolosa Sanuti, who was a noblewoman from Bologna, whether she'd read that speech or not, certainly the precedent that Hortensia set is something that she comments on in her own Latin oration that survives, which was delivered for a similar cause just much later. So there's Hortensia. Another few obvious people are the orators themselves. So Cicero and Demosthenes as being a gold standard of oratory. They often get cited by these female orators, often to explain, often in a kind of humility topos way of saying that they can't, they cannot compare to the eloquence of these prior role models. But also the speeches give an insight into the texts that were available and that they were reading. And you start to see, or at least I start to see implicitly, the influence of Quintilian in how they are structuring, their speeches. And I think there's a lot more work to be done on orations and the patterns that underlie them, which are interesting across men and women's orations. So there's Cicero and Demosthenes, and obviously Virgil. So one thing that I am often doing in my research is trying to link quotes in Renaissance texts back to their sources. So in this oration by Nogarola in praise of Jerome, she uses a quote which can be led back to the Virgil's Aeneid. And it's from a part of the text where the Sibyl is expressing that she can't possibly narrate all of the horrors of the underworld. And Isotta uses this, but kind of adapts it to her own purpose, perhaps for a more positive purpose and a Christian purpose, by saying she couldn't possibly convey all the virtues of Jerome. And there are many authors that use this quote from Virgil from late antiquity onwards. So she's becomes part of that tradition. So that's the Forum. And then, of course, another space was the Republic of Letters, which is, sorry, the Republic of Letters, which refers not to a physical location, but to a long distance community of lettered individuals, where participants often shared and promoted each other's learning through letter writing on various topics, and often they collected and circulated letters in letter books. And so this became the focus of the workshop of September, and the scope was 1300s to 1700s, so the long Renaissance period. But I did note that, and I thought I'll note now that it's important to recognise, obviously, Latin letters have always existed in an abundance. And in the medieval period, there's this one website alone which has over 2,000 letters, Latin letters by women, written, transcribed and translated, which are important to consider, maybe the continuities between medieval practices and Renaissance practices. But I suppose in general, most of us on this day were thinking about Latin more as literature. But that's not to say that the letters we were discussing were not actually physically sent. Turning to scholarship, so there have been significant advancements in scholarship on women's Latin letters in recent years, both in Latin and on the vernacular, and it feels that each year more is getting added to that, which is changing the landscape of intellectual history, really. Particularly notable is the production of new English translations. So on the right, you can see the Other Voice series has been important, as well as individual books by scholars, bilingual editions. And of course, those translations have increased accessibility to a broad audience. However, there also was major work done in the 17th century onwards, that kind of philological work, and also just the collection of manuscript material into these printed editions, which are still essential today, and sometimes, at least in the case of Cassandra Fedele, is perhaps the only basis for her work, because manuscript material is harder to come by. So there's been a lot of work done that we are building on today. The purpose of the workshop was to build on that scholarship and perhaps to integrate it, from its Anglo-American and Italian counterparts, to build upon what has been an examination of so many figures in isolation and in relation to each other, and to try and expand that perspective to also include connections to their male peers and role models and contemporaries and just the larger intellectual networks of their time. So we were thinking about things both in context and also in a lot longer term perspective. And the goal was to connect individuals to their communities. So one brilliant case study, I think, for the Republic of Letters, and also the theme of the workshop, is Isotenogarola, especially because this woodcut image, which is taken from a late 15th century collection of biographies of famous women, and it's often called Isotenogarola, but it's actually sort of a generic image of the scholar in her study, and it gets reused for a couple of different women. But this image kind of became the poster girl of the day, and it was expertly kind of transformed into different forms by Emma Yadanza. So I'm going to look at Isotenogarola and one of her major texts, because this is really what brought me to MAP in the first year of my PhD, as I went to look at different versions of one of her texts. So who was she? She was a very well-known humanist and intellectual in Verona in the 15th century. And by her late teens, she was already corresponding in Latin with major figures of the time, and especially with people connected to the early humanist educational centers around Verona, Padua, and Venice. And she was educated by one of the pupils of Guarino of Verona. And she's left behind letters, orations, a poem, and also a disputation on Adam and Eve, which I'll talk about now. Firstly, I'll just highlight some of the challenges that she may have faced as a woman engaging in the lettered Republic of Letters in Latin, because certainly there are aspects of it that wouldn't have been easy, which we can perceive just from the correspondence itself. So firstly, in this sort of male-dominated intellectual landscape, it seems as though often in formulations of praise, her male peers often point out that she is a rarity, or that her learnedness has somehow caused her to exceed or overcome her sex or her nature. And also you get sometimes this sentiment that being too feminine or womanish is sort of used in an insulting way, and the aspects of her that are more virile are praised. So we get that coming up in correspondence to her. And then she also brings this up herself, for example, in a letter to her uncle about possible hostility even to the idea of women's education and Latinity. So one of her letters to her uncle begins, "I'd often wanted to send you my unpolished and unworthy writings, but when I thought of how many men, if they should be called men, consider learning in women a plague and public nuisance, this deterred me from the task." And so, it highlights certain societal obstacles that were certainly there, but also I think by reading her work, we can look at tools she used to actually overcome those and to still produce and engage with themes and genres of writing that were potentially prohibited or frowned upon. And I think it's also interesting to see that she certainly had supporters, and that pathways to learning were often created by male peers and family members, as well as from women in her life. So in one letter from Lauro Querini, we see him encouraging her to read certain authors in order that she may master the art of speaking well, and even the art of disputation and the science of defining human matters. And this is something which really comes to the foreground in her disputation over Adam and Eve, which is really a synthesis of classical and theological learning. And it shows her taking part in that with similar tools to her peers. So the text itself, which is quite well known, I think, at this stage, is a disputation between Isotta, who defends Eve, and her friend Ludovico Foscarini, who's a real person, a Venetian diplomat, who defends Adam. And it takes the form of a few exchanges that are centered on this question: who sinned more, Adam or Eve, in terms of who caused the fall of humanity in Genesis 3 by eating the forbidden fruit. And obviously, this is a question that has a very long theological tradition of interpretation, and also you could consider visual depictions of this scene as being has taken part in that debate as well, in terms of where blame is assigned and rhetorical strategies that are used to defend one or the other party. So that's the main topic of their disputation. And by writing in Latin on this question in this genre, we could consider Nogarola to be possibly even a minority voice, but also someone who defends a minority viewpoint, which is that Eve sinned less than Adam, which makes it quite interesting. And so my research, certainly for my MA and for the first year of my PhD, was looking at trying to situate this text in its theological perspective by looking at what others had said about this question in Latin, and particularly those voices that carried the most weight, and those voices who I knew that Nogarola had read because of citations that were explicit or implicit in her own writing. And to see, and against that background, to look at what was unique or interesting about what she was doing. And I found that whilst patristic sources were certainly important, and they were often the authorities on that question, and they often defended Adam, often it was scholastic sources like Peter Lombard and Thomas Aquinas particularly that were really the gateway for Nogarola to access the previous sources, and also which gave more of a structure to the debate. And nonetheless, she interestingly uses a lot of the same tools as these authors. However, she comes to a different conclusion, which is that Eve sinned less than Adam, which I think is interesting in itself, because it shows that, you know, disputation is considered to be a very objective and scientific method for establishing the truth. But if you get someone using the same tools to come to a different conclusion with the same data, then it questions how objective I think that process really is. And so that for me was a really fascinating thing to discover by looking at a minority voice such as hers. And to highlight to you then some unique features of her defense of Eve. So firstly, one thing she does is go back to the sources, which is actually quite typical of a humanist to do. And she looks at the Vulgate Bible and points out that grammatically speaking, God actually commands Adam in the singular and not Adam and Eve in the plural to not eat the fruit from the forbidden tree. And the logical foundation of her argument is also interesting, because she says that if Eve is inferior to Adam, as per what the authorities have said before her, then she cannot be blamed for the fall, because if she is to blame, then she actually must be superior to Adam. And she highlights this logical fallacy in the arguments of prior sources through using Aristotelian logic and various other tools. So I think it's a very subtly transgressive text, but it's very interesting to look at the tools she uses. And most importantly for the theme of this talk is it's part of the Republic of Letters, because it seems to me from the manuscript material at least that this could have taken the form initially of epistolary exchange that was then edited into its final form and circulated. And during my Leverhulme Fellowship at MAP, my goal was to examine all the extant copies of this text and to travel around and compare them and trying to establish, you know, what was closest to the original. And it seemed to me that it was a good example of how the epistolary format was a good vehicle for also other genres of such as disputation, and also topics that women might not have been able to engage in publicly. So, you know, if they couldn't preach, but they could at least through the letter form engage with important theological discourse. And I really recommend also this version of the text by Thomas Hendrickson, which is the most recent, which comes with a commentary and running vocabulary, which is definitely the most updated. And whilst I was exploring that text, I also was experimenting with ways of classifying and comparing errors by looking at different manuscript versions of the same text. And this really took me into the realm of philology and textual criticism. And it's something that I have talked about more on previous MAP paleography courses, especially in Gaston's Latin paleography session, because there's a lot to discuss here. And I think even for people not engaged in textual criticism, it's very good to have at least a working knowledge of some of the problems that come up when you go back to those sources. So moving on to the summary of the day of the workshop, this was our purpose, and the day was divided sort of chronologically, ordered chronologically, I would say. But before we got started with the talks, we actually had an amazing opportunity to go and look at the Biblioteca Ricardiana, which is in Palazzo Medici Riccardi, which houses both printed and manuscript material. And we got to look at a variety of texts that really set the stage for discussions and talks for the rest of the day. So we went there, bright and early, and had a tour. We've sort of learned about the history of the place, of the collection, of the frescoes. And then we had a look firstly at some 15th century miscellaneous collections of poetry and letters. And not only texts that contained work by female authors, but also some of their role models. So one particularly nice manuscript we looked at was a facsimile of Virgil's Aeneid that was illustrated by someone in the workshop of Vespasiano da Bisticci in the 15th century. And then after we looked at the manuscripts, we moved on to the printed editions. So one of the images here is a printed text from the 17th century that combines works by Laura Cereta and Cassandra Fedele. And these are really crucial because they contain sort of sometimes the only existing portrait that we have of a certain author, which obviously can help us to visualize the person and also to discuss to what extent that might be a true reflection of them. And also these texts are really the ones that have provided the foundation for English translations. So we had some time there, and I think it gave us a good insight into sort of the physical artifacts that we're working with as historians that we would then go on to talk about when we arrived at MAP. So moving to the proceedings of each talk, I'm going to very quickly summarize what each person contributed. Session 1 was based on 15th century, and this was Alex and I both discussed sort of some overlooked or underappreciated contributions of women Latinists in the early 15th century based on archival research. Firstly, Alex from Warwick University looked at Polissena Grimaldi and Sancho of Chiaramonte, and essentially looking at one letter revealed how much can be learned about very little known figures, their engagement with Latin, and also their relationships and their interests. In terms of the broader context, she looked at how this one exchange between the daughter of a Venetian primary school teacher and a noblewoman from Puglia might be able to challenge a perception of women Latinists as being confined to a certain social status or region. And she also looked at networks of correspondence and possible relationships of patronage that supported literary studies for Polissena and others. Then in my talk, I looked at the Latin letters of Battista Malatesta, which I'm currently editing for my PhD. And I kind of over-ambitiously decided to focus on all of the themes in the call for papers, which included humanism, education, rhetoric, classical and Christian sources. And I spent the first part of my talk looking actually at the textual transmission of those letters, which are based on one manuscript, and kind of some strategies that I've been using to try and improve the text as things stand so that it will to enable a translation to actually take place. So after doing that, I then looked at some major themes. One theme was sorrow and consolation. So the genre of consolatio is one that many humanists engage with, and I was interested in how Malatesta's engagement with that theme compared with people in her social network. And for that reason, I highlighted one consolation letter that was written by Leonardo Bruni, that was conserved in the archive in Florence, which showed that consolation was being used also at a state level as well as at a personal level. And I explored also, different traditions in the theme of consolatio, because there are classical traditions such as that deriving from Seneca, and the idea of stoicism and a stoic response to grief, emphasizing kind of the universality of death and kind of the cosmic insignificance of people, which should therefore make our grief less at the loss of an individual life, and some ways in which that sentiment comes up in some of Malatesta's peers, and also to contrast it with her own consolatory letters, which, however classical in style, were nonetheless a lot more Christian in substance, and we're indebted a lot to Jerome and his letter collections. And so we explored Christian Stoicism. And then I moved on to this theme of spirituality, with a focus on the Clarissan order and what could be learnt from her letters about her theological and spiritual beliefs and that of her sister, and how they may have found role models in medieval collections of letters by even St. Clare herself, which exist in Latin. And so that was essentially just a few highlights of things that I talked about. Then moving on to session 2 was, we were still in the 15th century, but moving on to different authors. So both speakers in this session focused on Cassandra Fedele. Firstly, there was Jada's talk, which looked at how Fedele established connections with contemporary literary circles, and specifically at how she used humanist Latin to engage her audience. So Jada was very interested in rhetorical strategies, including sort of devices that used her femininity and the ways in which she tried to forge relationships that were perceived as honest and virtuous. So she pointed out a lot of passages looking at style and linking it to gender, and also how different methods were used depending on the recipient. And then in Sarah's talk on a very similar theme, but it was on a similar theme, but it included also more visual analysis. So Sarah is currently doing research at the University of Padua and aiming to provide the first interdisciplinary analysis of portraits associated with these writers' names. And in this particular session, she sort of traced also the transmission of this famous portrait of Fedele, and making possible links between her writing and then this portrait, and also the Latin mottos that accompanied it, and different ways in which these portraits have been translated. Then after lunch, we had 16th century speakers. So we had Antonella, who is kind of a leading expert on Olimpia Morata's life and works. And Olimpia Morata is an Italian scholar who's devoted to humanistic studies and who ended up spending her last years in exile in Germany with her Protestant husband. And Antonella highlighted her cultural and intellectual background, her time in Italy, and also what led to her flight to Germany and her early death at 29. And then a highlight of that talk was also reading a translation of one of her letters. And then Hannah's talk looked at a comparatively lesser known author called Anna Palantia, and established who and how many Annas might have existed. And her goal was to reconstruct Palantia's position within humanist circles in Europe, and also to trace the evolution of her as an author from her early letters up to her later letters. And then lastly, we finished in the 17th century, and we had Megan talking about the Dutch author Anna Maria von Sherman, who was an active participant in the Republic of Letters. And her talk looked at aspects of her biography, so looking at tensions and linking them to tensions faced by female scholars more generally at the time. And some key themes that came up were balancing domestic roles and piety, and also performing modesty. And she also looked at letters sent to male versus female colleagues, and ways in which the letter form allowed women to explore unique concerns, and also concerns they had in common. And then finally, we ended with Antonios's talk, which was looking at Swedish female intellectuals, with the main figures being Queen Christina of Sweden and Sophia Elizabeth Brenner. And he's been doing some interesting work analysing their surviving correspondence to explore how they used the ancient literary tradition. and looking at the significance of these sources on broader discussions of women's roles and education. So that's what the talks we listened to. And in terms of, questions that came up, we had some good discussions about how specific words were being used in letters and whether those words were being used literally or figuratively. We had the question of were these Latin women of the early 15th century also learning Greek? And if so, what and where is the evidence for that? What kind of elite are we working with, and how reflective is this small elite of larger practices? We also thought about to what extent it's helpful or appropriate or preferable to use terms like proto-feminist or even women Latinist when we're doing historical research and talking about the past. And also whether it's helpful to separate women's writing in Latin from women's writing in the vernacular. So these are very big questions that came up that were discussed happily over aperitivo at Dondino Boutique, where we were also able to order cocktails named after some of the women that we had talked about that day. So it was a very nice way to continue the conversation in a more informal setting. And overall, it was a very, it was a great day that fostered very interesting discussion. And hopefully this is just a starting point of future projects, publications, and collaborations that we will continue to have. So that's all I have to say about the summary of the event. And I think the last thing is obviously to thank MAP, all of the members that made it possible, especially Alessio, Federico, Gaston for their advice, and also for the help and the practicalities of hosting. And also to the speakers, because the day in a way was kind of a way of us recreating some of the principles and practices of the Republic of Letters in general. So for that reason, it was very unique and enjoyable. And so I will end there. Thank you for listening, and I'll be happy to hear your questions.
Thank you very much, Florence, for this very complete and detailed overview of this workshop and this fascinating topic that you explored. I wish I could be there too. So now the Q&A is open. So if you have any questions, please write in the Q&A box so we can discuss it while we still have Florence. And I promise not to keep you for too long, Florence. I will start with my own questions, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Yeah, so my first question is that how did your wider access to archival materials and being at MAP in Florence help you or enabled you to pursue this project and also put together this workshop, which is part of the broader project, I believe?
Yes. For me, it was, it was a fundamental experience to be at MAP for this, especially at the start of my PhD, and to be able to travel so widely, supported by a fellowship at the early exploration phase, when you have the time and luxury to explore and to go back to manuscript material and then to make sense of it and decide what to write about. So that was essential. And also simply the advice, the mentorship, the camaraderie of people at MAP for all types of questions, whether that's how to transcribe something, translate something, getting second and third opinions, helping with access to places, all of that was and still is essential to my research. So yeah, it was a great thing to do. I'm very glad to have been able to do it. It's also interesting because often I think when you set out to do archival research, you think that that's going to be the answer, that you're going to find the answers to your questions, and often you just find more questions and more sources.
Right. Yes. So how did you navigate the archives in the beginning, how that changed later on? And the second part of the question is that how did the digitized material help you?
Well, for me, I suppose a major change is that I changed the author of my thesis based on new findings. So that's one thing. And what was the second question about digitalized?
The digitized material
for
your PhD project and also
I
for this.
see. The material I digitalized.
or
Yeah.
or you know, in general, if they're,
In
you know,
general.
digitized.
Yeah, well, that again, like it's essential because it's almost like I've been able to create a personal library that will probably serve not just the thesis, but many other projects and hopefully future projects, and also a way of making things accessible to others. And it's been great to have the images also as a teacher to use as exercise material, you know, for paleography and things like that. And so, yeah, it's been great.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry for very technical questions, but we do have a question from our audience. So wonderful to hear this lecture about Latin women. Were there written letters in Greek or Hebrew? And they also thanked you for this illuminating lecture, which I second.
From what arose on the day, we did discuss together the fact that there were many of the women that we talked about may have learned Greek, but we had a lot less material for that. I think of those discussed on the program, only Olympia Morata had published in Greek. But so that, and I can only speak of my authors in the 15th century, where I hear about women who have learned Greek, but I don't have the actual evidence for it. And as with Hebrew, I'm not sure, but that's beyond the scope of my research, but definitely worth investigating.
Yeah, that's an interesting question.
Yeah. Just to speak of Nogorola, for example, she's basing her analysis of Genesis on the Vulgate in Latin, but she never goes beyond that to think, well, how was Jerome translating that text and what was the original language behind it? So that she's sticking with the Latin.
Okay, right. So you defined the time window for this workshop, and I believe for your talk 1300 to 1700. I wonder, how did the role of these you know, studious women or educated women who were, you know, literate and fluent in Latin, how did their role change from the 14th century to the 18th century? How was this not just talent, but education contributed to this? It was diplomacy or scientific discoveries or rediscoveries.
Yeah, I mean, something that I noticed, it seemed like there was a change, and maybe it's just the individuals we chose to focus on as 8 speakers. But so the individuals, certainly that I'm looking at in the 15th century, like Battista Malatesta, someone who's actually a ruler, who's like co-ruling. Pesaro is the daughter of the Count of Urbino, who actually has an active diplomatic role, who's actually writing orations to plead for real political reasons. That for me changes with Isotta Negrola onwards, where it feels like there's a more self-conscious, studious, scholarly approach to writing orations and Latins, where her role is much more the scholar in the study rather than the active noblewoman who's also dynastic and politically engaged. And then later, when we got towards the talks in the 16th century onwards, we had like Reformation and Protestantism coming in and the different beliefs coming up and challenges faced by those authors. So yeah, there's definitely changes that took place. And I think that came up in individual papers that also looked at different parts of Europe, you know, because my research is quite Italy centric, but we had speakers talking about Germany, Belgium, Sweden. So that was also good to see the continuities there and also the differences.
Okay, and the nature of the texts that these women were dealing with, or the content of them, was there any changes from the 14th century to the 18th century?
I again, from my perspective, for my author, I'd say early 15th century, I felt like there was a lot of, it felt potentially a bit more spiritual and classical, Christian in substance over classical. Then you get some authors who highlight the classical. In terms of content, I would say similar genre and purpose, but perhaps more self-consciously scholarly. That's the only thing I could say is a real difference. Also, different religious beliefs come across later on, depending on whether the Catholic or Protestant strands of thought that we discuss more after lunch.
Very, very helpful. Thank you so much. So now I would like to ask about your case study of Nogarola. Why did you choose this case study particularly? I know that you talked about minority of voice and also more materials that you found on this specific case study, but were there any other reasons, or if you want to elaborate on the reasons that you already mentioned about choosing a case study, because this is basically the center of your research, right, of your dissertation, and the workshop is in alignment with your dissertation project. So how did this happen, this decision?
Well, the reason I pursued a PhD in the first place, which was on Esoto but it has actually now changed, was because it was a text I studied at master's level at the Warburg Institute. And it was the first text actually I ever came across that was written by a woman in Latin. And I found it via an English translation. And then the process was really peeling back the layers, going back to the critical edition, then going back to the manuscripts and realizing that so much changes in those gaps. And even the way in which her work has been translated, that can really change the meaning of the text. And so I thought there was a lot more work to be done there. And that's why I applied for the fellowship and for a PhD. And it's also it's like a fascinating text in general, this question of who sinned more, Adam or Eve. It's really a fundamental one for humanity at that time. And it had an impact on kind of social relations and practices. Not only, it wasn't just a theological idea. So I loved the theme, and I also, it was interesting to learn about her education and to kind of add more nuance to the way her story was being told. So yeah, that's what captured my imagination. And it also allowed a pathway for me to go back to manuscript material, because I'd always been interested in going back to the original language of a text, but I never perhaps realized there was even a further step that could be taken, which is what I've been able to do as a PhD student.
Right. Yes. Thank you for all the details about your methodology that you're sharing today, because I know that it is very helpful, especially for graduate students and also scholars in the early stages of the research. Another question that I have is how do you see the future of this project, but like a broader topic of women Latinists? Where are the gaps in the scholarship? Where do you want your project to, what gaps do you want to address in the future of your research?
Well, yeah, this was something that we reflected on at the end of the workshop. And I think personally, I'm very interested in reconstruction of texts themselves. I think there's a lot more work to be done philologically, and also on integration of what I would say are more Anglo-American and Italian trends, bringing together both sides, especially when concerning a certain individual. And yeah, to perhaps, as was the purpose of this workshop, also connecting women to their male peers a little bit more and to their wider networks, which often takes a lot of work. But many of us on that day were interested in doing that, and it involves a lot of work on primary sources. And I think that in that respect, not that much has changed compared to when Paul Oscar Christella was writing 50 years ago, and he said, I think what needs to be done is more work in the original language and on primary sources, because there's so much to do. And it's not just, I think, with women writers, but with writers from this Neo-Latin writers in general. There's, thousands of neglected authors in unedited form that are waiting for people to bring to light and to connect.
And you mentioned that you have also contributed to the paleography courses at MAP. Can you talk a little bit about that and how you incorporate your research into your teaching methods?
Yes, well, it's been very nice to be a guest speaker occasionally in Gaston's Latin paleography seminar. And also as part of the course as a whole, which I know is coming back soon in January. So I usually just use documents that I found in archives or in libraries, and then highlight questions that arise, but particularly getting students to look at texts themselves, looking at expanding abbreviations, looking at how to classify different areas and make sense of them, and to discuss approaches to editing text, because often, you know, there's no right answer. And I also generally, when I teach, I always sort of try to inform courses that I teach with my research. And like Isotonogorola, for example, is someone that I teach about in various, you know, classics courses, Renaissance courses, language courses. I think there's always a way to bring her in, which has been really nice.
Right, thank you. And also, can you talk a little bit about the FORTE Academy, because that was mentioned in your bio, and so I'm sure that, you know, we would like to know more about this. I promise this is my last question.
Okay. So yeah, since 2019, I've been organising courses and workshops via FORTE Academy that focus on the classical tradition and that are based in Florence. So the primary course that I teach is Classics Abroad, which is really an introduction to the transmission of classical antiquity in literature, art, philosophy, etc., for undergraduate students of classics. And then Women Latinists, that was another course that was taught the last 2 years. Radical Renaissance Writers is another online course. So essentially, it's a vehicle for people that are interested in interdisciplinary study of the classical and Renaissance worlds, whatever their level of knowledge. And yeah, it's been a nice thing. It's something that I do in my spare time. That's something that's really nice, because I also try to promote using overlooked primary sources, and also not just having intellectual activities, but also practical activities that are always fundamental to the courses, like the ones that I talked about today.
Right. Thank you very much. I know I said that I know you're not feeling well. I'm gonna end soon, but I keep asking questions, but I promise that was my last question. And so I just want to invite everyone for our next week's talk that is going to be by Professor Noelia Perez on portraiture, gender and power in 16th century art, creating and promoting the public image of early modern women. So this is not totally unrelated to today's topic. So I would like to invite everyone to join us again next week. If you would like to receive weekly invitations with the bio of the our guests and a little bit of a summary of the talk on weekly basis, please email me. I have put the email address in the chat, so you can email me and I can add you to our mailing list so that you can receive the invitation on Thursday evenings. This is all Eastern time, and also a reminder on Tuesdays at noon right before the talks. Thank you so much, Florence, for joining us today. I know it's very late, and thank you so much for giving this detailed overview of the successful workshop and about your research and all your achievements. We wish you the best of luck for the rest of your research and your PhD. And also would like to thank everyone who joined us today for this special talk. I hope to see you again next week. Please email us if you have any questions, if you have any concerns. And again, I would like to thank our donors, our friends who have supported us to continue our work. And if you want to become a friend or a donor, please click on the link that I have provided in the chat and join the circle of friends of the Medici Archive project. Thank you, everyone. And I would like to, at the end, I would like to wish the world peace. Thank you, everyone. See you all next week. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.